Before I start, I just want to mention the fact that if you start to argue with anyone like McAdams or any of his supporters or other people who are what we call lone nutters, people who think Oswald was a lone nut who did it all by himself, and they believe the Warren Commission, they'll always say, but there were 3 shots. Everybody said there were 3 shots. We found 3 shell casings, and we found the rifle, and all the other things. But I disagree. I mean, I don't think there were only 3 shots. I don't think there were huge numbers of shots, you know, it wasn't like a machine gun attack, but I think more than 3 shots. And of course, just to get you all excited, I want everybody to have a mental image of John McAdams. All right, so then you get all a little bit excited and cross. Okay, so here's my questions for you. Might want to get a little sheet of paper. Write down how many shot sounds you heard. Those weren't actually shots, that was me banging my pen against the microphone.
5.
Well, how much time elapsed between that first shot and the second shot? And how much time between the second and the third? Okay, now, you've heard about the acoustics, and you've heard about the Warren Commission, and you've heard about some of the witnesses say this, and some of the witnesses say that, and you've got Tom Dillard says one thing, and Gene Hill says something else. I've got a new interpretation completely of all of this. Because there's never been a detailed, proper study of what witnesses Dealey Plaza said about the timings of the shot. Now, I don't know if any of you read the detailed stuff from the House Select Committee. Many of you did. What a chore, and I thank you for doing that. But I did it too. And they worried about eyewitnesses, and they were keen on witnesses being able to say, well, which direction did the shots come from? And to put sort of a verity on it, they hired some psychologist from Harvard to do the investigation. Had them firing rifles in people's ears, well, next to people's ears, or not far from them. Most people would say, oh, I know, they were looking for which way did the shot come from. Now, anybody who knows anything about guns and shooting knows that if you have a supersonic bullet with a shockwave, you're going to get the direction about 90 degrees wrong. And that's exactly what happened. So they came to an in conclusion that nobody could actually tell where the shots came from just by listening to the shots. So I would say that's probably a fair assessment. You could hear the shots, people know what they are, you know where they came from. People thought the first shot, a firecracker. John Connolly thought, my God, they're shooting at us with automatic weapons. Semi-automatic weapons. Gene Hill thought it was just about enough to be done with a bolt-action rifle. And you remember the Warren Report, other sources commonly describe the Kennedy assassination in terms of the most common or usual statement that 3 shots were heard by most of the witnesses. In fact, the Warren Commission themselves, actually, after a few days of testimony and listening to various things and getting the reports and the transcripts, they sat around and had a little executive discussion of this. And most witnesses have been saying that the shots were evenly spaced, or maybe there was a little more space between the first and second shot. They didn't come to any conclusion about that, but that roughly equally spaced, but maybe one pair of shots was a little different from the other. didn't take it any further than that. Now, other evidence of what goes on in the sounds of gunshots in Dealey Plaza echoes. Louis Alvarez, a famous Nobel Prize winning physicist, he didn't win a Nobel Prize in acoustics, I can tell you that much. But in 1976, he did a jiggle analysis of the film. And what that means is he listened to some of the controversies, and he was actually part of a TV program called Special Investigation for CBS, I think it was called Can We Now Believe the Warren Report, narrated by Walter Cronkite. And he came up with the theory that if you look at the film, you can suddenly see jumps, places where the camera must have jerked in Zapruder's hands. The theory is that the sudden jumps and jiggles in the point of the camera were due to involuntary startle reactions to the sudden noises of the shots. This is Alvarez's original diagram of the Zapruder jiggles and his estimates of the times of the shots. And in my bag, I think I've got a little laser pen help, but probably won't. Well, let's just let you look at these things. I can dig up a pointer thing, but no bother. I thought we were going to be projecting on the screen. These are Zapruder film frame numbers as used in the Warren Report with frame 313 as the head shot. Now, according to Alvarez's analysis, what you can see here, first of all, a lot of jiggles going on. And then finally there's, here at frame 215, he claims it's a wounding shot, which I don't necessarily believe. That's the one that caused Kennedy's throat wound, and or his back wound. In other words, a single bullet. And then, further on down here, where Alvarez has nothing, at sorry, you can't see my arm. At 235, that's about where Governor Connolly said he was hit. There's a little bit of a jiggle there just before 235. But expert witnesses in the analysis of the Zapruder film testified to the House Select Committee that, in effect, there could be any number of shots in all those jiggles. Not just one, not just two, not just three. It could be many shots in there. Okay, there's other jiggles here. There's a little tiny one there, little one 270, a bigger one at 290, and then after 313, the interpretation of those somewhat different looking jiggles is that Zapruder was saying, was shouting that they just shot Kennedy or killed Kennedy, and he was still holding his camera, and the shouting is what made the camera move. But Alvarez's conclusions were that there was a first shot at frame 177 with a jiggle that arrived in the camera. This is sound travel time plus 2 or 3 frame reaction time, which is probably not unreasonable. So he's got a jiggle there about starting at frame 182 or 181. There's a pretty good jiggle, and that he thinks is the first shot. And then why doesn't he think there's any other shots between, say, 190 and 200? I don't know. We'll come back to that. And finally he says there's a second shot at 215, and that causes another little jiggle 5 frames later, 220. And then finally there's another shot at frame 313, and there's a jiggle that goes along with it. Now, unusually, think about it for a moment, that jiggle is exactly coincident with the headshot wound in the film, whereas the other ones were delayed by a little tiny bit, so it's not quite the same thing in terms of sound, unless the rifle was much closer to Zapruder. He was very close to that fence.
Unless it was a visual reaction rather than an
audio. But even if it's a visual reaction, still there should be a couple of frames delay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, never mind, So his scenario looks something like this. There's one shot here at 177, another one at 215, and another one at 313. Now, that's a sequence of shots, something like bang, bang, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, bang. Okay? None of the witnesses said anything like that.
No.
Okay. Now, all of this we argued about till the cows come home, but during the investigation, there was an acoustics analysis of the Dallas Police tick development. And they reported back to the select committee that there were 4 shots on the Dick development. 3 from the Texas School Depository area or possibly the Dallas Tex building. In fact, from the point of view of the sound analysis of the impulses on the film, you cannot tell which. They're too close together in space. And then another one from behind the fence. And remember, oh yes, that was, Kennedy was practically right in front of the rifleman, but he missed. So somebody gonna hit him from 100 yards away with a crap rifle, but a guy with a really good assassination rifle, working, waiting, biding his time for the exact moment, firing from nearly point blank range, he's gonna miss, right? Okay. Well, I don't know about that. So their pattern was 2 shots at 1.65 seconds apart, a gap of 6 seconds, and then 2 very closely spaced shots, one of which was from the dark grassy knoll. Now, I first encountered this idea, not by reading the report. I paid no, when it was all being done, I paid virtually no attention to all these reports. But I read a book called Conspiracy by Anthony Summers. And he spelled out some of the stuff that was reported in the acoustics analysis. But he didn't do a terribly good job of working out what the scientists were saying, because there's essentially a tape time and a real time. And the problem was that they found the tape was running at a slightly different speed from real time. And the stuff that was in his book, or that it was in the report, rather the House report, wasn't properly adjusted for that. Like the House committee, in other words, was very, very confused. So I took my own, I decided at that point I wanted to study and see what eyewitnesses said. What did they say about the timing of the shots? How many were there? What was their spacing? We can call them ear witnesses, rather than just eyewitnesses. Now, did any of you take note of what you heard? What was the total time interval between shots, sounds 1 and 3?
5 seconds.
About 5 seconds. And what was the time between 1 and 2?
1 second.
Okay, and
I would say
between
2 seconds.
2 seconds, okay, and between 2 and 3?
It's very similar.
I thought
A bit longer.
that 3 was about 3 seconds, and then 2 seconds between 1 and 2, then 1 second between 2 and
Yeah,
3.
okay. That's not far off what a lot of people said, except that your estimates tended to be over. So I'll explain why. Witness accounts appear to vary wildly. So at first sight, you think, I can't tell anything from this. But I studied this in details, and there were actually only a very small number of ways in which witnesses described the shots they heard. Most witnesses. There are some of them who wanted to praise that I heard a shot, and then 5 minutes later I heard another. But most of them described more or less the same thing, but in different terms. So I looked up the Warren Commission, and I had to actually plow through all 26 volumes to find testimony of people who were in the plaza or in the motorcade. Plus, I found one very clear account in that book about Should We Believe the Warren Report, which was from a witness who wasn't questioned by the Warren Commission. So, in all, I've got 70, I can't remember if that's 71 or 72, but anyway, there are basically three categories. A, 3 rapid shots approximately equally spaced. Maybe those also said the second, third were closer together than the first and second. Those with recall in whole or in part was consistent with the acoustics evidence of a group of shots, a gap, and then some more shots. That's about 10 witnesses. Now, people like Gene Hill, for example. There were other people as well. And those, then the third group is those who weren't very clear or were not asked to describe the sounds of the shots. And a lot of these were people questioned by Wesley Lieber in April of '64, just before they quit. And I had the impression they said, I know all the answers, I just want to get it on paper that they heard 3 shots and so on. So you can see sort of like a sausage machine being operated, and perhaps, he's looking out the window at the flowers and saying, oh, that's a nice set of pansies in that flower. And how many shots did you hear? Oh, look, there's another flower, there's a tree with leaves on it. He's not really listening to the witnesses, he's not digging out what they said, he's not asking them how long it took between the shots. So that's why I have a limited amount of data. Not because it isn't there or wasn't there, but because the commission lawyers didn't bother to ask the questions. By April, they thought they knew all the answers, I think, and they didn't really care what people said. Then there's a third, so there was this large group that didn't describe anything. Now let's think about some of these witnesses. I'll give you a category A witness to get the typical flavor of one of these witnesses. Mr. Robert Jackson, he was one of the open press car passengers taking pictures. They were just approaching the Texas School Repository when he heard the sudden sound of a gunshot. Okay, so he was asked, what's the best estimate for the time between the first shot you heard and the last shot you heard? I would say 5 to 8 seconds. Okay. Can you give us a breakdown between shots in which you heard? How many seconds elapsed between each one? I would say it seemed like 3 to 4 seconds between the first and second, and maybe 2 seconds between the second and third. Then he says, are you sure you heard 3 shots? Yeah. Now, of those 36 witnesses, 28 were similar to Jackson. They said the interval from 1 to 2 was longer than the interval from 2 to 3. 6 of those witnesses said 3 shots were evenly spaced, and 2 said the interval from 2 to 3 was longer than the interval from 1 to 2. So pretty much, I think we can conclude it's very likely that these shots had a sequence in which the first 2 shots were further apart than the second and third shot. But not a lot was in that. It's not huge difference because some of those people described them as equally spaced. Okay. Of those witnesses, 14 gave details about the time between the shots. They estimated it in seconds. And the average for 13 of them, that's the number who gave what I would call sensible answers, was 5.8 seconds for 1 to 3. Very close. Yes, to yours. I think you were the one who said 5 seconds. Yeah, or 6 seconds. Okay. So that had a standard deviation of 1 second. So that's an indication of uncertainty. And that SD, standard deviation, means that roughly 2/3 of the witnesses provided estimates within 1.1 seconds of that average. Okay. That's where phrases such as 6 seconds in Dallas comes from. Famous book title. Josiah Thompson, yeah. Well, I think he was one of the first people to try to do something like this, but I think not nearly as well as I did. Okay. Now, turns out the number in each subcategory was not the same as the number who provided quantitative time estimates of the intervals. Useful numerical data was lacking, so people would say, well, the second, third were closer together than the first and second, but they didn't then get asked how many seconds. So what I did was, where I had a numerical estimate, I would weight the average by the total numbers of similar witnesses. And so based on the verbal witness accounts, I'm not paying attention to the film, I'm not paying attention to the acoustic analysis or anything. The T12, time between 1 and 2, was 3.4 seconds. Some people said very close to 3 seconds, didn't you? Yeah. Okay. And from 2 to 3, 2.2 seconds. So the ratio of these intervals is 1.55 plus or minus 0.14. That's pretty definite that I think the witnesses on average came up with the first two shots being further apart than the second and third. Any statistician can attest to it. This means that we have to reject Alvarez's null hypothesis that the interval between the second and third shot was much longer than the interval between the first two. Witnesses say no. Sorry, Lewis, that can't be the case. He's dead, so. But no, he can't be right about this. And in fact, when you use a probability contingency table to work out the probability that I'm right, and that the witnesses disagree with the theory that Alvarez put forth, the probability is he's wrong greater than 99.9%, which is effectively certainty.
So when I did this in 2013, independently, not knowing you'd done this previously.
Sorry?
When I did this in 2013, not knowing you'd done this
Yeah.
previously, I came up with the exact, done in a slightly different way.
Sure.
I came up with the exact same conclusion you came
Good.
up with.
Okay. Now, there was a second group, remember I said there were 10 witnesses who said bunch closely spaced shots, a gap, and then more shots or a single shot. Jean Hill was a good one, who was in this. Everybody says she's crazy, you know, she's a crazy lady, because she heard more than 3 shots, she must be a nutter. Okay. Well, no.
She was close.
Huh? She was standing right
Yeah,
there.
exactly.
Anybody's gonna know she was. And, I'm paraphrasing, because otherwise it goes through question by question, and she gives these answers. I can't do a southern accent. I think there were at least 4 or 5 shots, perhaps 6, but I know there were more than 3. The first shots sounded like they could be fired from with a bolt-action rifle, one right after the other. She's a little bit wrong about that for a man of her conduct. Because they tried testing the man with her, they couldn't shoot it as fast as about 1 to 1.5 seconds. Just couldn't get a shot off that quickly. I'll come to that. See. Then there was a distinct pause, that long pause. Then I heard more. They were different, quicker, more automatic. There were at least 4 shots. I almost swear I heard 5 or 6, but no more. Certainly no more than 6. Another chap named Richard Worrell was standing out in front of the TSPD, and he said, I heard, and the same thing, you can ask questions, and he's answering a little bit at a time, and I've just brought all his answers together, and some were sometimes added to it what the question was. I heard 4 shots. When I heard the first shot, it's too loud to be a firecracker. For some reason, I looked straight up over my head. I saw 6 inches of the gun, maybe 4 inches of barrel and 2 inches of stock. Can't remember, would that be reasonable for the panicker? 4 inches of sticking out barrel?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Then it fired again. I saw a little flame and smoke come out of the barrel. Was that plausible?
Yeah.
I looked toward the president. He was slumping. I looked up again, turned to run. Why? The third shot was fired, I saw that too. Wasn't running looking up, was he? Anyway, everyone was screaming, so you can imagine there was a terrific scene of panic in the other plaza, just at that very moment. The Zapruder film, of course, never captures the sound. I ran from the corner of the building. As I got to it, I heard a fourth shot, right in succession. So most witnesses estimated total time for 3 shots of 6 seconds. The Zapruder film shows the whole assassination took 6 to 7 seconds. How can they be reconciled? What's the answer? Eyewitnesses estimate the time of duration and are normally exaggerated and distorted. Now, I was reading conspiracy and thinking about this very question. I remembered something I came across browsing in the library, something that's very hard to do these days because they take all the books away and put in internet access points everywhere. If you actually want a book, you have to know what book you want, you have to write it down, get them to go and get it from storage in some other city or something. But back then, you could browse the shelves, and I came across a really interesting book called Psychology of Time. And then I started finding other papers written in psychological journals and even in legal journals in which either psychologists or law professors would ask, they'd usually stage a crime in their room. Students would be sitting there, like taking notes, just sit down, and then move. And suddenly, a man bursts in with a gun and shoots the professor. Okay. And then looks up at the class and fires again and runs out of the room. And of course, the students are collapsing and fainting on the floor. And then the professor gets up and he says, okay, that was just a demonstration. What I want you all to do is write down exactly what happened. Tell me how long it took, how many shots you heard.
What he was wearing.
What?
And
What he was wearing, what did he look like, and so forth. The earliest reference to this kind of thing being done in a classroom, as I can find, dated back to 1895. One of the questions the teacher asked was probably called recall. He said, okay, just from memory, don't actually get an apple out now, just from memory, in an apple core, which way do the seeds point? Do they point towards the stem or towards the bottom of the apple? That sort of question. Testing people's recall of actual things that they've seen. Back then, everybody knows. What I found was that estimates of time duration are normally distorted and exaggerated. And here I've collected a bunch of results from papers. This is actually up to about 1982 when I concluded this part of the work, and I haven't actually extended it anymore because people still say the same things. This little plot of what we call a semi-logarithmic plot. So everything on the left goes up in terms of ratios, and everything along the axis is in terms of actual time. What you can see is that most witnesses in these experiments exaggerate the time roughly by a factor of 2. And you see some points are joined together. Those are points where there is an element of stress. Like, that you've got a student in one of these little psychology experiments, you poke them with a needle, or something, cause pain or make other noise or distractions. An element of stress of some kind. And elements of stress always tend to cause longer time estimates. Remember, witnesses under stress often say, gosh, time seemed to stand still. Everything happened quickly, but it seemed to me like it was all in slow motion.
Except the brain going to...
And your brain going into overdrive or underdrive or whatever. So we take the typical time perception report to be a factor of 2, larger than the actual time. The true duration of 3 shots must have been about 3 seconds, not 5.6 seconds. Alvarez's first jiggle is at frame 181. Can anybody tell me, I mean, he may be right, I think he probably is, but what's wrong with that?
The oak tree.
Who?
The oak tree.
The oak tree.
Yeah.
If you're up in that window and you're trying to shoot the president with a rifle from the 6-4 window in the depository, there's an oak tree in your way. The question is often been asked, why didn't they shoot while it was coming up Houston Street towards the depository? Had a very clear shot. They had no oak trees in the way. Why wait until they turned and were driving away and then shoot the first shot through an oak tree? Any ideas? Why that might happen?
The argument is because the limousine would accelerate and the Secret Service would then look up and see where the gunman was and then pick it off.
That's for Houston, yeah.
There was no means of escape. Once they were going down into Dealey Plaza, the only way was forward. Whereas if he'd have shot as they approached the depository, they could have turned right into Elm.
Well, it's all
You could have gone,
all
yeah.
kinds of
Concentrate
options.
on.
Of course they could, yeah.
But
So
you know,
that's
whatever,
that's
whatever, you talk about whether there'd be an escape, but if you shot Kennedy and they came up Houston from that window,
Yeah, as soon as
there'd be no escape.
As
There's
soon as
plenty of
they-
time to draw a bead.
he takes the corner, he's still got to accelerate the car.
Hmm.
He's still got another
You've got
couple of shots on.
everyone would be
I-
looking that way.
I think if there
Whereas from
was a
behind,
shot
everyone's
fired-
looking in the opposite direction, away from the shooter.
It's only a theory,
Misdirection, isn't it? It's.
but I think the shot was fired a little bit early through the tree due to nerves.
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 Yeah. He was only 26.
What about the shot that hit the road surface to the
Well, maybe
left?
that
Do you
was-
think
that
was
may well have
that
been
was the
one.
first shot. Is that the first wobble, do you think?
Oh, yeah,
The
probably.
first jiggle?
Probably. Well, I can't say whether that was the one that hit the road or not. That was, if that was the shot, if there was a shot that hit the road, it would have been one that hit it at that point. And that would be because it ricocheted off of a tree branch or something.
Okay.
Yeah, all right. So, okay, this, Alvarez sees a jiggle, but look, so all these other jiggles here, and he can't account for these. All right. Then he says, Kennedy is wounded at or about frame 215. And then there's another jiggle around frame 240. Connolly thought he was hit at frame 235, plus or minus a couple. There's definitely, if you ever, has anybody seen those pictures from the Zapruder film, they're very clear, showing Connolly going from turning around, wondering what's going on, from there.
And he kept to that all his life. It wasn't as if he changed.
He never changed his mind, and in fact, he came out straight away and said, I definitely was not hit by the first shot.
You can actually see his lapel lift, can't you, at one point?
Well, they talk about that, I don't know if that.
Don't you think that?
I don't know whether that was the bullet going through his lapel or not, or.
I think that was Nelly pulling the back of his jacket too.
As they
Who
do,
knows?
as they do.
It's more like his shoulder, his shoulder goes.
Anyway, whatever. The
Yeah.
other interesting thing was that he was able to hold on to his hat,
That's, yeah.
even though that hand was later wounded.
It's a silhouette idea, isn't it, with the bone?
Always hold on to your hat.
Something like that, yeah.
Always hold on to your hat. If you're a Texan.
Yeah, hold on.
The other thing, Mike, that I think about it with, of course, Madeline Sitzman was gripping Zapruder's legs, wasn't she? We don't know how she was reacting.
Yeah.
And Madeline Sitzman, his secretary.
She actually covered his ears at one point, if you look at the Mormon photograph.
What?
Sitzman actually covers Zapruder's ears,
Oh.
if you look at Jack White's analysis.
Okay, well, I don't know.
But I'm a great fan of Jack White, so that's me out the picture.
Anyway, all those jiggles in the frames from 190 to 200 and 205. What's going on there? I think one of these three shots was, the next one was in there, and I think a wounding shot actually took place somewhere around 190 to 195. That was when he was behind, or just going behind the freeway sign. And you can in fact see what happens. Initially, the first shot happens, he turns to his right, looks back over his shoulder. And then something happens at around frame 190, give or take a few. He's very suddenly, his head swivels straight forward, his arm comes in, and that's the last we see of him, so he comes out of the frame, and he's going like this. Okay. And that's about 2:20 or so. And then Connolly's hit after that. According to Connolly, to what everybody thinks when they look at the film. Now, in addition to the ear witnesses, there's one or two unique cases. Chief Curry, he thought he was probably, writing Oswald's posthumous death warrant by giving his testimony. But he said he gave a standard time estimate when he was asked how long it took. He said 5 or 6 seconds. But amongst all the other witnesses, he was the only one asked to express his perception in terms of the position of his car, which we know was traveling at 12 miles per hour, same speed as the limousine. He was asked, can you give us the approximate location of where it was when you heard the second shot? And I think they were referring to where the president's car was. And he said, well, it was just a few feet further because those shots were in fairly rapid succession. How many feet do you mean? 25, 30 feet along. The third shot said 15 or 20 feet further. Well, first of all, he gives, with those numbers, he gives a very good estimate of the time ratio. Very close to the 1.55 from the other eyewitness accounts. And then we go to his actual time estimates. But now let's do the calculation. 12 miles an hour is equivalent to 17.6 feet per second. So his estimates of distance can be converted to time. The result is that 1 to 2 is between 1.4 and 1.7 seconds. And 2 to 3 is around 1 second, give or take a little bit. This does agree well with the estimates from witnesses after correcting for these exaggerated reporting errors. So the question is, why do so many witnesses only report 3 shots? In most cases, as you can see from this pattern, it's just the first 3 shots. Well, in front of a lot of people, or very close to a lot of people, you ever been near a motorcycle that's suddenly revved up? They're not quiet. He revved his Harley-Davidson motorcycle, rode straight up onto the curb, into the crowd, dumped his motorcycle, and ran. He didn't walk, he ran up to the Texas School Depository building. His perception was that I think he said he saw the pigeons suddenly all jump from the roof, and he thought maybe the shots were coming from up there. So he had reasons to head to the school depository. People were screaming and panicking. Everybody, a lot of witnesses described how people were panicked and screaming. They were lying down on the ground, covering, men were covering their children or their wives with their bodies. People were running away, like Richard Worrell, who I ran away, then I heard another shot. And also, shocking events can sometimes cause subsequent errors, subsequent loss of memory of exactly what happened next. And that was, you've got to say, that was a shocking event. And so I've got just one example of the last where someone has exactly this happen. Mary Muchmore, who took the so-called Muchmore film, she didn't testify. That's curious. But Lyndall Schoenfeld described her film this way. She photographed the motorcades that came down Main, turned into Houston, and proceeded down Houston. She says she heard the shots, she panicked and didn't take any further pictures. But a review of the film shows a picture of the assassination route, motorcade going down Elm Street, beginning just before the shot that hit the president in the head, continuing a short period after that. So she said, I stopped filming. But her memory was false. She didn't continue to film photographic evidence. So, can we reconcile this stuff with the acoustics evidence? Assuming the acoustics evidence is valid. Remember, we don't need the acoustics evidence to prove all the things that I've said about the shots thus far. But we all read there were only 2 shots that could be fitted into the first part of the shooting sequence. Bang, there's another shot. Another impulse on the recording. Dr. Barger lists 3 impulses in his report, or testimony or whatever it was. 0 seconds, 1.65 seconds, and 2.75 seconds. In other words, 1.65 and then 1.1 is the ratio he has. But then he said, that can't be a shot because you can't fire that rifle so fast. You can't work the bolt fast enough. All right, now, everybody here, I hope, would agree with my next conclusion. It's illogical, Captain. It's a political reason for rejecting an impulse, not a scientific reason. His job was to find whether there was any evidence for a conspiracy, not to find such evidence and throw it away because he was told to or anything like that. So, we've all read about the eyewitnesses' accounts. 2 men on the Texas Building Depository 6th floor. I'm not going to go into all those witnesses because that's outside the scope of this report. The impulse timings do agree pretty well with the interpreted eyewitness accounts of the shots. The Zapruder film evidence could readily be interpreted to agree with 3 early shots in the space of just under 3 seconds. Early shot, 177 to 180, misses the car, causes JFK to bring his arm down and turn sharply until he disappears behind the roads. Second shot wounds JFK shortly before he emerges into view. In fact, I think possibly he's been wounded just as he disappears behind the sign. It's hard to say. The third shot hits Governor Connolly around frame 235. Witnesses in the second category, group shots, pause, and then some more, also agree with the full picture as seen from the Zapruder film and the acoustics data. Okay, nothing in my conclusion requires the acoustics data to be correct, but I think it's a totally interesting fact that there's a very close agreement provided you don't make political judgments about scientific facts. Okay, first of all, my conclusions are that eyewitnesses' accounts tell us there were 3 shots close together over 3 seconds. Then 1 or 2 shots several seconds later. Sequence is consistent with the events seen on the Zapruder film. I somehow seem to have a blank. The spacing of the shots is so close together, the Mannlicher panel cannot be fired that roughly. I agree with that fact. I disagree with the interpretation that therefore it wasn't a shot. What I would say is there had to be 2 guns in or near the depository. This is fully consistent with the jiggle analysis of the film and the acoustics evidence. Doesn't rely in any way upon the latter. And if you go back to my recording at the beginning, it wasn't possible for me to regulate that precisely when I was making the recording, but the intervals were 1.83 seconds, or about 2 seconds, and about 1 second or a little more, and a long gap, 4 seconds, and then a very short space between channels of sounds 4 and 5. More or less that's what the acoustics evidence seems. Right. Okay. So that is all I can present to you at this time. Clearly, I guess I have to write this up for the echo. It's the reference list that will kill me. I'm going to sit down and write out the Warren Commission witness list.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike.
So I'm happy to take questions, listen to discussions.
So can I just